Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with my colleague Sheena Hyland, who's also involved in the project with me. And we thought it's a very useful opportunity to give you, I suppose, our work in action, but it links really nicely, I think, with all the kind of case studies that have gone before, because it's about, I suppose, we're trying to develop a sort of a framework that will help us in UCD, and hopefully feel free to take it and use it as might suit your own context, about an assessment for inclusion framework. So we're giving you, I suppose, our work in action. And again, I'd like to thank Sheena Hyland and Lee Wolfe, who's not here, but is part of this team that are working on this project. So first, it goes back to Joanna's kind of definition earlier about what's assessment, and many of you have mentioned feedback, but our first thing was that when we're talking about assessment, we are also including the kind of the national definition, and those that know me know that I was involved in this national reform work many years ago, but we are also talking about assessment that is graded, the green there, assessment that is also feedback, which is like staff-given feedback, with many students mentioning there about the feedback, but also assessment as learning, which is this idea, as Joanna was mentioning earlier, of students leaving being able to self-monitor and self-evaluate their work. So every time I say assessment, we mean these three. And I think this, when you see it later, is actually quite a valuable way to try and pull it all together. So you've been listening all day to what are the outcomes of inclusive assessment or assessment for inclusion, which is, I won't get into the terminology too much, but they are interchangeably used. We've decided to use assessment for inclusion. And the common themes that you've heard today are things like that it's more equitable, fairer assessment, justice, which are the outcomes of the assessment. So not just the processes, but fair outcomes. And that also leads to then supporting student success, student sense of belonging, I think Tara mentioned in her talk, student sense of belonging, social inclusion and social justice, but also there's a whole underlayer of staff and students' values, and I think this is being mentioned a lot in kind of many of the talks here. But underpinning in it, and our QQI will be particularly important about this, the standards still have to be maintained and they still have to be fair. So this is in the context of we have to also maintain the sort of fairness and kind of standards. So how do we do this? Well, in UCD, we decided it'd be very useful to develop some sort of an institutional framework that would help guide staff, all the staff, involve the students, and come out with something that would guide us, but isn't prescriptive. And I think it's getting that balance between guidance and something that's not too prescriptive. So we're doing it through a qualitative research method. We've been looking at a lot of literature around this area, a lot been done internationally. We've been running some webinars on it. We interviewed some expert authors in the area. We interviewed our students. We interviewed heads of teaching and learning. We had a Students as Partners scheme that Jen and Robert were mentioning there earlier. We had a Student as Partners scheme. We've been running workshops. We're presenting to you here today. We're going to build on what we hear back from you. So there's this iterative kind of a qualitative process around to sort of try and develop a framework. So I'm going to present you what we've got to date and see again if it's useful for you to use. And I know your discussion you're going to have afterwards is this useful for yourselves in your contexts? And, you know, is there something that you can take from this? So what we've discovered through a lot of our conversations, talking, particularly the interviews were very insightful, because every time we talked to people, they kept saying, well, it's all about the student in the middle, it's unique to the student, it's about their values, where they're coming from, their identity, the assumptions that they have. So this self in the middle was really, really key in relation to kind of some sort of a framework. So it's not a list of things to do, but you really have to think and step back what it is about this person in the middle and what they're dealing with. So when you listen to the students and the case studies, it's very much uniquely around kind of the student in the centre. But it's also about the staff, their assumptions, their values, what they think is inclusion, their beliefs around it. And it's really those two together that really is centre to any kind of a framework or the way of building. And listening to all the talks and listening to sort of, as people are talking, it is also about the staff and then their relationship with each other. And I think one of the students earlier mentioned empathy. And I think, so those things about the relationship between the staff and students, and that is so central as a starting point before you jump into things like choice and flexible and those kind of things, that there are really this relationship and those two sets of people, I suppose, the staff and all those wider stakeholders and the students as partners in this process. So again, some of the talks about empowering students is really, really key. But also it's within a context. And it's very easy to kind of say, well, this works in my context. But as you see in the case studies, they're all very different contexts. So the context might be institutional, it might be further education, kind of versus higher education. It might be, well, I'm in a maths discipline, and I'm kind of in a kind of social sciences discipline. So it's very much around kind of the context. So there is no one way, and it's very important. The context is key. And I think some of the questions earlier brought that up. When they're saying, well, orals and that choice isn't allowed in our context, but maybe it is in other contexts. So context is key, and that was really kind of the centre, I suppose. So those two kind of aspects of the framework were really, really important. But well, what do we mean about self in the middle? So again, before you launch into kind of sort of more directional kind of design things we can do, well, what do we do about that self in the middle? And I think there's a real need in whatever way to kind of interrogate people's views and assumptions, their values in it, their emotions in it. Again, I think Tara mentioned that, the emotions in it. But also their knowledge around some of these areas and their understanding of it. So really what we felt might be really valuable, and we've only started working on this, is some sort of reflective questions that might help people interrogate this. And these are our starting ones, but they're only draft. But you come up with your own. But I think there's a step there that we really need to kind of do before we launch into this. So, like, what are your values? What do you think about this? Do you think, giving choice is fair? But what about the ones who, don't take it? And really interrogating this sort of reflective process. What do we mean by student success? Is student success grades? It is. We know for a lot of students it is. But sometimes it's just being a sense of belonging in the institution. And that's their understanding of student success. So really interrogating. So whatever you come up with there, but I think there's a need, we kind of feel there's a need for a step in that kind of area. So interrogating the self. So the next thing is, well, as Roisin was saying, like, what about some design principles? And these, I suppose, what do we mean by design principles? Are they going to be something that sits on a shelf somewhere in whether it's QQI shelf or whether it's an institutional shelf? Are they going to sit somewhere, or do we actually kind of use them? So we've called them design principles because there's an action to them. And I suppose when you look at what principles are useful for, they're usually some sort of a guiding statement that will, I suppose, they're kind of the middle ground between lots of the research theory that's going on, which is great and puts it in an evidence-based way, and then there's practice. So there's somewhere in that middle ground between all the nice ideas of practice and all the theory and something that might help guide in the middle. And where that middle is can be different, but some sort of a way of actually helping us design and have these conversations that we can at least be kind of, talking around the same thing. So they guide practice, they guide policy, and they make us think about, well, what next, or what do we need to do? But on a very practical level, principles should have some sort of a verb, and they should be understandable. So we should be able to understand them. So what principles do we choose? what was in and what's out, I suppose? And you'll be glad to know, as all the case studies, as they're talking through here, many of the things that you have mentioned are coming through in our conversations with the students, our reading of the literature, our conversations with the staff, and our conversations with the experts. So these are the principles here. I'm going to point here. These come around here. So they are sort of, again, remembering that there's a self and the context in the middle. And I can't stretch down that far, but you can see the principles there. And I'll just go through them and explain what we kind of have meant by them. So the first, I suppose, 5, there's 10 in all. And again, maybe that's too many, or maybe it's too big or too small again, but we have 10 at the moment. And the first one is around be empowering. So the students should, and many of you talked about that, involve the students, empower the students, whether it's students as partners in bigger schemes or in curriculum design projects, but really giving voice to students. Involving them in co-designing, but also if we're considering assessment also includes feedback and self-evaluation, that for and as. Well, in the feedback space, what does that mean? Well, they should be judging their own work. That would help empower them. So we have been thinking of these principles with both assessment for, of, and as learning in mind. The next one is authentic, and again, many of the case histories, I think I mentioned there, Anita mentioning the inquiry-based learning, is really authentic. And Teresa's work, the real kind of holistic, so really authentic, meaningful to the students is really, really important. And when you look at the massive literature around authentic learning, it includes, the obvious stuff like relevant, meaningful, but it also includes things like students' identity, who they are, who they think they are, and that personalized to them. So authentic is quite a wide-ranging kind of term, but it's really important, and many of you mentioned that, I think, in your case studies. The next 2 are interesting because being diverse is obvious in some ways. Oh, well, again, the students mentioned exams not suiting them earlier. So it's obvious, we should diversify. But there is also a slight danger, and I know this from running the assessment module in UCD, that if you say, diversify, and then what, staff go off and they give loads of different assessment, and then the next one, students find them unmanageable. Because each time you bring in something new and unfamiliar, it can add time for students to get on top of it. So I would always say, be diverse across a program, think about diversity in a kind of thoughtful way than just adding in diversity because you can overload students with too much diversity. So I always kind of think diversity across a program is nearly a better way to think about it because the next one, which is really important, is being manageable. When we talk to our students and we talk to our experts, and when we ask staff what workshops you want to be more inclusive, manageable assessment came through a lot. So staff and students are really feeling overloaded. And if they're overloaded, this is coming through as a really, really big issue. And I think those who are working in have small modules and multiple modules. It's really nice to see some programs have just one module, but where you have multiple modules, this overload is hugely damaging, I think, for students and for staff. But also things like the space, appropriate weighting. You do hear students say, well, I did a load of work for this and it was worth 5%, and you kind of think, well, the weighting and the manageability. Being flexible, again, that was mentioned by many of you, this idea of allowing choices and flexible, well, choices is one thing, but flexible deadlines is a hugely, by deadlines being flexible, it really allows students to maybe work to their time and when they're available, whether they have care responsibilities or they're traveling long distances, that flexibility is really key. So I think those first kind of 5 support students who are maybe overwhelmed, unfamiliar with some of the assessments, disempowered by some of the assessments, not relevant to their experiences, isolated by it, not suiting their free time. And in some ways, this is a better way of thinking of it than, there's the international students, and there's that students, and there's those students. All students struggle, including those students, with these kind of things. And so if we can come at it from this inclusive, I think it's a really nice way of thinking about it. And the next 5, I suppose, were allowing choice. And again, really nice method, I think, Edel and Jessica and Maeve and I think Therese all mentioned kind of the choice. So it's really coming through as a really valuable option. But it can be choice in topics or methods and bringing in choices and feedback approaches. Could I get audio feedback instead of oral feedback? Really, choice is one of the key things. And I have to say, I'm really proud that UCD this year in September is allowing choice of assessment as one of the kind of 15 drop-down menu of assessments when module coordinators go in to pick their assessment. And I think that's a really nice, if I have to say so, kind of advantage that it's built into the system now, that staff will see that when they look at their assessment. So it's legitimizing choice of assessment. Scaffolded was mentioned by a few people. This idea of structuring and scaffolding kind of assessment, either within a module or kind of across a program, that there's some sort of a support. I think the students again mentioned continuous. I think the videos of students mentioned continuous is useful. Not too much continuous, but continuous for some is useful. Transparent. Interestingly, to be transparent was the one that was mentioned most by the students. It was their top one. Tell us what you need. Be clear on your understandings. Give us the rubrics. Be clear in the instruction. That was mentioned, which I thought was interesting. I thought they might say diverse, but actually their top one, when you looked at the coding, was transparency from the student voice. Accessible formats, obviously, is a really key one. Clear purpose. The next kind of two were probably mentioned, well, the being culturally responsive, again, was really, really key. Again, Tara's case study, Tara's in the room, Tara's case study about, being very culturally sensitive to the group that are there in front of you. So this idea that it's meaningful and culturally responsive is the way we try to describe it. Don't know if that's the right words, but that's our working kind of word at the moment. Culturally responsive to the groups. And that was often mentioned kind of like, again, I haven't normally been in education, or I'm coming from a different background, or a different race, or a different country, or just being culturally responsive, either the content or the activities that they're doing. The next one coming through, Joanna mentioned it, is the kind of the social justice and social inclusion, social justice is coming through a lot in the literature. And I know when we looked at the literature and we talked to people, it came through subtly when we were talking to people, but it's coming through a lot in the literature. So I think it's really important that we kind of, where does this fit, or how do we actually describe this in words that we can all understand in a kind of design? So one way we kind of thought of describing this is really, developing ideas and actions in your assessment that maybe support others in society. And I think if we can talk in language like that, this is the sort of space we are trying to unpick this social justice thing, which is really important. But when you're talking to staff, I know when you're talking to staff in UCD and they've got 300 students and they're saying, I can't do that, it's too far off where I'm coming from, I can't even think about that. Well, is there a way that you could actually, is there something in your assessment that could be beneficial to somebody in the community, beneficial to some of your in engineers in society, or whatever, and trying to unpick that one a little bit. It's such an important one, but maybe we need to kind of unpick it a little bit and how we, describe it to kind of staff. So I suppose, again, just looking at these five, if you're looking at, if you can get these ones right in your design, it would help students who are struggling, that they're not playing to their strengths, that they find assessment stressful or feedback stressful. They find it hard to get organised. A lot of the neurodiversity students find it hard to get organised. So if it was structured and more kind of transparent, it will certainly help that group. It's not suiting their needs. They're not unsure of their expectations, or it's not supporting where they are coming from, their community, or where they think they're coming from. So they're the second set of principles. And really, I suppose, just looking at them, they were ranked differently, interestingly, by the different students and the different groups we were talking to. For example, as I say, the students mentioned transparency. Interestingly, the more heads of schools talked a lot about diversity, and I think the experts talked more around empowerment. So people are not exactly talking about inclusive assessment in the same way, but maybe that's okay too. They're interconnected. As I was saying, if it's too much diversity, it can be unmanageable. If you give too much continuous, you're doing overload. So they're related, and there can be tensions between them. They can be stage level or context related. Does it need to be more scaffolded and transparent in early years? Can it be more kind of open in later years? And some have more immediate kind of kind of implications or kind of design implications, and some have more kind of short-term and some have more long-term. So they are kind of, they're not necessarily weighted in different ways. Certainly then, you know, some of them kind of overlap a little bit. For example, you know, they're not all on the same journey, or some are on the same journey. Like, so flexible and choice very much are kind of very connected. So choice could be under flexible, so it's worth keeping both of those. Empowering and choice are very connected. So there's some that are quite connected. So could you collapse them if you were doing a set of principles? Or is it worth kind of, you know, separating them out? And I suppose Sheena, myself, and Lee, who have been looking at these over the last year or two, you know, we've been struggling with some of these questions. Like, if we want to use these as a design, kind of either module level, or a program level, or at institutional, or even at national level, if there was something like these here, like, do they make sense? Do they make sense to yourselves? Would they make sense to the students, other stakeholders? Are we missing any? I did wonder, should we have more be transparent about validity? We kind of assumed all assessments, you know, is that one we're missing? Should that be there? And it's fairness, and I have seen principles where fairness was a principle, but we kind of feel fairness is the whole underlying, if you're thinking about it as design and actionable, is fairness kind of the underlying thing for the reason for doing it all? So we were playing with, is that the overlying aim, outcome of these? But if you were to be fair, well, then these are things that will help you being fair. So it's trying to get what's a design versus what might be an outcome. Is belonging a principle? You know, should we have it as a principle? Or in doing those other things, is belonging, again, maybe an outcome? So if you felt you were being an active citizen, if it was more authentic, maybe that would help your belonging. So again, where does that fit? These are the questions that we're kind of thinking through. What are the key outcomes? You know, we've put some there about student success and equity and fairness and justice. Are they them all? Is it accessible language? We have gone with the assessment for inclusion, and one of the reasons we did was we wanted to kind of get the message that no one assessment is either inclusive or exclusive. And again, many people mentioned that today. For example, the exam suits a lot of students and doesn't suit others. Podcasts suit some students and doesn't suit other students, as somebody was just mentioning. So an assessment is neither inclusive nor exclusive because it suits some and doesn't suit others. Whereas we kind of felt assessment for inclusion gives this idea of this assessment and you're trying to be more inclusive. So it's a subtlety and we're still playing with it, but we've gone with assessment for inclusion, but maybe people won't understand that. How do you work with the complexity? This is a complex area with multiple variables. How do we actually make this complexity simple that people can kind of relate to? And the big thing we're thinking, where does grading fit in all this? Is grading kind of in all of it? Or is it a separate one? Should we have one just for grading? I don't know. So that's when we're playing with. So I kind of will give you this. Oh, sorry, just what I wanted to say was, because when we showed this to a staff member recently, they said, we are far too busy doing all of that in our modules. And I thought, okay, this looks like to be inclusive, you have to tick all these things in all your modules. And that would be just too overwhelming. So there is something about messaging how we come about this to bring not just people in the room here who are obviously interested in it, but our colleagues on board. How do we kind of bring them on board that aren't overwhelmed with this long list of being inclusive you have to tick? So is it kind of like are some of them, like if these were modules and the flowers were students on different modules, do you do some of them in different modules? Certainly diversity across a program. Should some of them be done? Are there easy wins or quick wins? What could you do or what could you start with? Which ones would be maybe useful? What can you do? A little bit like the kind of one step in UDL, like what one could you start on? What could you start with? I think it's important that we don't lose people in the kind of messaging that just feels just too much to be able to do. And I know this is a busy slide and I can leave you can have a look at it afterwards, but what we're starting to do now, and hopefully we might build in some of those case studies into it and link to them, but we're trying to develop maybe some sort of an assessment resource, either an article or a case study or something under each of the principles for both assessment and for and as learning. So you can see, like, we've mapping assessment across a program. It might be a good one for diversity. Students requesting specific feedback. Again, I think Joanna mentioned that under empowering today. Culturally responsive maybe, allows students to draw examples from their own context. You can see them all. They're interactive orals, being more authentic now than just ordinary orals. So just, there's a starting to build resources, and you can have a look at those yourself, and certainly we will build that. So really, I suppose just to finish, I suppose what we're trying to do, and again, many of you mentioned today, it's hard to be inclusive for all students at all times, in all modules, all the time. So really, I suppose what we're trying to think of in this is trying to bring as many students into the net in our curriculum design and in our policies. Some may not get into the net all the time in every single situation, and maybe that's when, as the students were talking earlier, that the needs of the students and how we might accommodate students that don't fall into it. But it's really about, through these design principles at the different levels, to try and bring in as many people into the net as possible. And I'll finish with that, and just for the recording, if you like, there's the references. Okay.